On January the 22nd, 2017, Kellyanne Conway, counsellor to the US president, was invited onto the weekly NBC show Meet the Press to discuss the recent inauguration ceremony of Donald Trump. Something of a controversy had risen up over the past few days surrounding the size of the crowd that had turned up to witness the event. Trump himself had promised an unbelievable, perhaps record-breaking turnout. However, when it came to it, the ceremony drew a crowd only around a third of the size of that which had witnessed Barack Obama first take the oath of office in 2009. Not keen to admit defeat, however, the Trump administration had gone on the offensive, with Sean Spicer, then White House press secretary, defying experts in crowd size and reporters on the ground to state that the event had attracted the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, period. When Conway, on Meet the Press, was asked by host Chuck Todd why the press secretary would utter a provable falsehood, she responded that Sean Spicer had not lied, but instead given alternative facts. Conway's use of that phrase drew a barrage of criticism from the liberal wing of the world's media. Trump had, of course, regularly derided what he termed fake news on the campaign trail, but pundits and commentators had spent the previous few weeks wondering whether moving into the White House might see him begin to act in a more composed and statesmanlike manner. This episode seemed to not only disprove such a thesis, but also set the scene for a presidency which has often appeared to be engaged in a war of attrition with the very fabric of reality. The response from most of the mainstream media has generally been to ridicule each of Trump's lies as they have emerged. The website PolitiFact, for instance, keeps a list of all false statements involving Donald Trump, in which each falsehood uttered by the president is recorded alongside a brief summary of why it is a lie or, at best, only partially rooted in reality. And such reporting is important. We might, following Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky, be aware that the huge inequality in command of resources often leads to the media offering only limited critiques of those in power. Yet here it does seem to be functioning as a public service, recording and countering the pernicious lies of those in power. We seem to be living in an era of fake news, often propagated by some of the very individuals who themselves have popularised that phrase. In the age of Trump, Brexit and other populist movements across the world, the political battleground, whether in relation to the climate emergency, immigration, healthcare or whatever else, often seems to be less orientated around finding the best responses to certain issues, but instead around trying to figure out the truth of what those issues are in the first place. Political debate seems to have been transformed into a call and response of falsehoods and corrections, lies and debunkings. Today, I want to go beyond that tendency to just want to correct lies when we see them spoken, to consider the deeper effects of such a discursive turn. In doing so, I'm going to draw on the work of Guy Debord, who, in his 1967 book Society of the Spectacle, suggested that society had become obsessed with images and appearances at the expense of experience and observable truth. It's a book that I've touched upon a number of times before, yet this video should be as self-contained as possible, for it seems to me that Debord's suggestion that our culture and politics have become less and less grounded in lived experience has much to tell us about living in an age of mistruth and what happens when a society loses touch with that which is real. As always, if you have any thoughts, suggestions or questions as we go along, then please don't hesitate to pop those down below in the comments. And if you're new around here and this seems like your kind of thing, then please do consider subscribing. Finally, if you would like to get your hands on the script to these videos and some other goodies, then please do check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. With that out of the way, however, let's crack on with fake news, alternative facts, and the spectacular politics of Donald Trump. Over the past few years, there's been an increased popular interest in Guy Debord's 1967 treatise, Society of the Spectacle. Although now over 50 years old, mainstream journalists have turned to the book often as a potential source of insight into the present world and, in particular, the rise to power of President Donald Trump. Scanning through Society of the Spectacle, one can see why it has proven so alluring. Debord begins by declaring that, in societies dominated by modern conditions of production, life is presented as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Or, to put it in simpler terms, that contemporary capitalist society has become increasingly obsessed with images and appearances over experience and observable truth. Even prior to running for office, Donald Trump offered an interesting case study of this phenomenon. As the host for The Apprentice, Trump would set a series of contestants a business-related task each week, before, at the end of each episode, inviting them into the boardroom in Trump Tower, where, from the comfort of his leather throne, he would decide who would be fired and who would continue on in the competition. Now, as opponents have been keen to point out of late, Trump's own business career has been far from flawless. He's been involved in numerous bankruptcy declarations and launched countless businesses that have quickly floundered. Yet, to the producers, to the contestants, to the viewers of the show, all of this seemed irrelevant. He lived in a tower and had a golden toilet. There can be few better indicators that society might have come to centre on, in Debord's words, an affirmation of appearances and an identification of all human social life with appearances than a man who, by living in the right building and having the correct taste in interior decor, came to be seen as a figurehead for an economic system which he had failed to have much of a meaningful impact on. Throughout his work, Debord was adamant that it is not only those who find themselves the hosts of reality TV shows that have increasingly come to rely on appearances in this way. As I explore in one of my other videos on Guy Debord, we all do. Many of us spend as much time on social media attempting to appear happy, successful, and fulfilled by life as we do actually seeking out genuine self-fulfillment. Today, however, I do want to focus on those in the public eye. For Debord does suggest that celebrities such as Trump have a special role to play in the society of the spectacle. He argues that, such is the power of the images of excess that surround us, we have come to view our real lives as mundane and boring. Perhaps, for many, life under capitalism has made it so. Stars, however, in Debord's understanding of contemporary capitalism, serve as spectacular representations of living human beings, and project this general banality into images of permitted roles. Celebrities act as role models that we can aspire to be like, yet in doing so they tend to comply with certain societal norms, and in encouraging us to build our lives in their image, therefore sustain the status quo. Here again, pre-presidency Trump provided a great deal of support to Debord's argument. Trump's wealth is primarily inherited, yet he has managed to distort this through curating an image of himself as a self-made businessman who has earned his fortune through his mastery of the art of the deal. Thus, he continues to perpetuate the grand narrative of American capitalism that anyone can make it to the top if they have the right skills and ambition. Multiple people have argued that much of Donald Trump's success in the Republican primary process and then in the 2016 presidential election itself can be attributed to his transferring of the spectacle of celebrity to the political sphere. Douglas Kellner, for instance, has argued that Trump represents a stage of spectacle beyond Debord's model of spectacle and consumer capitalism, in which spectacle has come to colonize politics, culture, and everyday life. With the chief manipulator of the spectacle in the United States, Donald J. Trump, now becoming president and collapsing politics into entertainment and spectacle. One way in which we might suggest that this is so is in how Trump, first as candidate then as president, has pivoted how he presents himself, from being a personification of wealth and exuberance to a champion of the working class. Despite his multiple affairs, he has also managed to endear himself with the US's white evangelical community. His garnering of support for both of those constituencies has relied heavily on his channeling of anger at the status quo. He's presented himself as an insurgent force ready to drain the swamp and upturn the cozy political establishment. An image that has only been supported by the liberal portion of the world's media. Debord has much to say about such acts. He writes that, by invoking any number of different criteria, the spectacle can present false political oppositions as totally distinct social systems. But in reality, they are nothing but particular sectors, whose fundamental essences lies in the global system that contains them. The single movement that has turned the whole planet into its field of operation, capitalism. Debord thus suggests that politicians often co-opt anger at the status quo in such a way, yet whilst having little intention of doing anything more than mildly modifying the prevailing capitalist order, or in Trump's case, further reinforcing its inequities. What I'm primarily interested in today, however, is not these nefarious appeals to, say, the cause of the working class voter, but Trump's bolder deceits. For politicians attempting to curate a false or at best half-true image of themselves in the public eye is neither new nor unique to Donald Trump. In fact, so prevalent is such an act that entire TV shows such as The Thick of It, Veep and House of Cards are able to build their plots around the challenges that the domination of the political sphere by appearances over policy might present for those trying to do good, and the opportunities it might afford to those with more nefarious intentions. In each of these shows, however, the protagonists go to great lengths to hide the fact that they might be misrepresenting themselves or the facts around a particular issue. And long before he ran for president, Trump had little time for trying to conceal his lies in this way. Instead, he has regularly made claims that are not only false or highly exaggerated, but to any critical observer, obviously and openly so. The first question that we might want to ask of Trump and co.'s blatant propagation of falsehoods is, why? For, as documented by House of Cards and similar shows, the guiding principle of previous political epochs was that a politician should do their best to conceal when they are lying, and do their best to look statesperson-like at all times. This was the bedrock of Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016 and remains that of many of the more milquetoast candidates in the Democratic primaries this time around. And this in itself is a kind of spectacular politics, built on appearances over policy. Yet Trump's very obvious lies often seem to rupture this facade. And the reason he does so, to my mind, is fairly simple. The more ridiculous a statement he makes, the greater the number of headlines, opinion pieces, and Twitter threads it inspires. Capitalizing on scandal in this way has been a mainstay of Trump's career throughout his life, yet it was something he perfected during the Republican primaries in the lead up to the 2016 election. His outbursts during press conferences, at rallies, in debates, and on Twitter allowed him to soak up press attention to the point where few other candidates could get a look in. And there is simply no need to be the best candidate when you've obscured all others from view. Debord writes frequently in the Society of the Spectacle of the glitter of spectacular distractions which provide relief from the banalization which dominates modern society the world over. In a world where politics, perhaps above all else, is often deemed boring, Trump proved a distraction par excellence. Yes, as many people might have loved him as hated him, yet the absurdity of his candidacy proved far more engaging than watching Barack Obama and Mitt Romney debate the minutiae of taxation ever was in the previous cycle. Trump recognises this and uses it to his advantage, aware that to increase the ridiculousness of his claims is to allow him to further dominate the news cycle. Yet what effect effect does this prevalence of lying have on our political discourse? For when we think of political lying, we tend to think of propaganda. And the popular understanding of the goal of propaganda is to present us with a false yet totalizing view of the world, which is ultimately convincing. In the wake of the alternative facts episode, which I recounted at the beginning of this video, for instance, sales of George Orwell's 1984 shot through the roof. Penguin, in fact, had to print an extra 75,000 copies just to keep up with demand. And that book ends with its protagonist, Winston Smith, staring up at a portrait of Big Brother, the figurehead of the society in which he lives, declaring his love for him. Any doubt in the official ideology of Oceania he previously had having been expunged from his mind. To a large extent, Debord suggests that the end product of the Society of the Spectacle is that a populace does almost exactly the same. In his 1988 text Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, in which he expands upon some of his earlier ideas, Debord argues that the spectacle's domination has succeeded in raising a whole generation moulded to its laws. He essentially suggests that capitalist ideology has become so widespread as to be almost unquestioned by many. Then perhaps this is the case, but Trump's failure to conceal his mistruths seem to disrupt any potential for Trumpism to ever be uncritically accepted in this way. Whether it is his intention or not, by lying so blatantly, Trump seems to encourage more critical thinking, not less. But perhaps this is less of an intrinsically great thing than we might first want to think. For Trump and his surrogates have regularly used the phrase fake news to encourage a level of skepticism of the mainstream media. And the alternative facts that he does espouse have often been viewed as the other side of this coin, an attempt to construct what Debord, among many others, have called a false consciousness, or a sort of alternative conception of the world. Yet the blatancy with which Trump lies disrupts his chances of having anyone but his most loyal followers actually believe in this totalizing worldview that he offers. Nevertheless, both Trump's assertions as to fake news and his falsehoods continue to engender a sense of distrust amongst those in the wider population. The initial object of skepticism may indeed be Trump himself, as it is he who is lying, yet they awaken that part of our brains which seeks to criticize everything. If Trump is lying, we come to think, then maybe all politicians are. If Trump's position on taxation is based on utter falsehoods, then maybe all positions on such issues are too. Such a tendency to engage in this more generalized sense of skepticism has been most evident among some of the very news publications who have been so hostile to this notion of fake news. Katie Halper, for instance, has pointed to the manner in which the New York Times has attempted to draw equivalencies between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. If there's liars and opportunists on the right, the argument seems to be, then surely there must also be liars and opportunists on the left too. In his 2009 book, The Emancipated Spectator, Jacques Rancière forwards a similar argument of left-leaning cultural critiques based on Debord's Society of the Spectacle. He writes that Debord's ideas were supposed to denounce the machinery of social domination in order to equip those challenging it with new weapons. Today, it has become exactly the opposite. A disenchanted knowledge of the reign of the commodity and the spectacle, of the equivalence between everything and everything else, and between everything and its own image. There has grown a tendency to simply argue that everything is merely spectacle, and to sit back and disinterestedly gloat that one is aware of this. Critical thinking and skepticism are obviously vital and important, yet the goal of Debord's text was not to encourage us to view everything as spectacle, but to see through the appearances it relies upon to the truth concealed within. A tendency towards the former at the expense of the latter has, I think, been growing for some time. Yet Trump's propagation of blatant falsehoods has further solidified a societal mindset in which all that we might previously have held to be true is now up for debate. Such a scenario may mean that the spectacle and the society which has fallen under its spell has evolved to a point where Debord's description of it is slightly less relevant. Yet his writing still offers us much useful insight. For Debord writes that the domination of the spectacle led to a world in which there is no place left where people can discuss the realities which concern them, because they can never lastingly free themselves from the crushing presence of media discourse. He is suggesting here that capitalist ideology has become so dominant that it is no longer possible for many to discuss the issues facing us in a manner which imagines a world beyond that particular economic and political system. I'm not sure that this point in relation to capitalism is necessarily the case in the present. Nevertheless, the widespread skepticism which pervades contemporary political discourse does equally take away our ability to have the rich conversations that imagining alternatives to the present system require. For productive political debate requires some kind of shared understanding of the world. Whilst we might come to different, sometimes very different solutions, it requires us to have a shared understanding of the problems that we are aiming to address. Where the spectacular rhetoric of fake news and alternative facts has succeeded then, is not in presenting us with a series of false solutions to the world's problems, but in making it ever more challenging to agree what the problems themselves are in the first place. It seems to me that the blatant falsehoods offered up by Trump and his supporters, both online and off, have primarily provoked a response centered around debunking and responding by pointing to the flaws in that worldview. And again, such an act is important. Yet such efforts often seem to be driven by the notion that society is at risk of falling under a 1984-style subjugation to Trumpism. I don't think that's much of a risk. What is more likely, to my mind, is a scenario in which we become so prone to questioning every tiny fact that we are presented with that we lack any meaningful basis for political discussion at all. The challenge then lies not only in critiquing the pernicious lies of Trump et al., but also in risking the charge of naivety by refinding that which we might share with those who are at risk of believing all that such figures promote. For it is through doing so that we can rebuild a more genuine discourse and begin to work towards a more just world. Thank you very much for watching this video. I had so many requests to do another video based around the Society of the Spectacle, so I hope this has lived up to expectations in some way. Thanks as always to Ash, to J. Fraser Cartwright and to Michael V. Brown for signing up to the top tier of my Patreon page. If you would like to get a copy of the script for this video or some of my others, then I would massively appreciate you going to patreon.com/Tom Nicholas and checking that out. Other than that, a like on this video or a sharing it somewhere where others might enjoy it is always much appreciated. But thank you very much for watching once again, and have a great week.